Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today we're going to tackle Bavarian troops of the Napoleonic period. And these are actually a really cool project if you're looking for something a little uncommon. The Bavarians would actually fight on both sides during the war. Up to about 1805 they were fighting against France, and then they switched sides and they started fighting with Napoleon. Now for this, Napoleon would elevate Bavaria to a kingdom, which suited the Bavarians just fine. And then around 1813, shortly after the Battle of Leipzig, the Bavarians would switch sides once again, and they would end up fighting against the French on the side of the Austrians and the Russians. So if you're looking for an army to paint which you can use for both sides, you've got to paint just one army for a Napoleonic force. Make it Bavarians, why not? Now I'm using purely army painter paints for this because I fancy doing something a little bit different. All of them will be listed in the description below though, so if you want to paint along, just grab your brushes, let's get started. Now for this I've got my little Redgrass Games 360 handle. I really like using these. I've finally got the camera set up in such a way that I can hold it there and that's perfect, you guys can see everything. I've started from a white primer here, and ordinarily I don't. There's a bit of a reputation for white being a difficult color to work with. But I've used Army Painter Matte White Spray and gone over it with a couple of light passes. It's important that you don't just spray it all in one go until it's white, because you're going to clog up some of the detail. So a couple of lighter passes, where the first one won't cover properly, don't worry too much about it. Just let that dry, come back. Same as you would with paint, really. So we'll start off. I have here tanned flesh, and big surprise, we're going to paint his skin. Reason being, this is one of the areas that we will find the easiest to sort of make a mess with. Now, this will look quite dark going on. And where ordinarily I say, oh, don't worry about splashing things, we'll come back and paint them later. I do tend to find it is a little bit faster overall with these Napoleonic figures if you try and be tidy. Don't worry too much if you do make a mess. Obviously we can still fix that. But take your time and just paint his flesh. Now you'll tend to find that covers fairly well, especially over white. I've just dabbed in a couple of areas that only took one coat. What we'll do now is the facing on his jacket, his cuffs, and his collar. Now for this I'm going to use Moon Dust, which is a very light yellow. This would be different for certain companies, so I've linked in the description a sort of a cheat sheet so you can see some of these. And again, working from white, this covers super well. Don't worry too much if you splash like the piping on his collar, because again we're going to paint it a different color. His chest is a mess of equipment, so you're not going to need a huge amount of yellow here, but make sure you do pay attention to his cuffs as well. Now, I don't mind admitting, sometimes I do make mistakes, and I think Void Shield Blue might be better as a highlight color later on. So I'm actually going to get that electric blue that I passed up, and we'll just paint a coat of this over instead. Now that looks much better. What I'm going to use now is a little bit of pure red, and my advice is you really want to have an agitator in this pot, and shake the absolute dickens out of it before you use it. I'm going to switch on down to a character brush for this one, and we are going to carefully paint in all of the piping on his uniform. Now this one, unfortunately, is not really a quick way of doing this. There's no cheat to this. This is just take your time. Careful as you can. And we'll come back and have a look at that once that's done. Now at the moment this might still look a little dreadful. I would suggest leaving the red piping near last because you'll find it easier to tidy up blue or yellow over the top of that than the other way around. What we'll get now though is some dirt spatter, and I'm going to water this down. And we'll use this for all of his wooden details. So predominantly his musket, and as well on these fellas, you'll see this chap here, he's got two sort of long things down the side of his leg there. The one at the front would be the case for his ramrod. Or at least I assume that's what it is, based on the images I've seen. So we'll paint that in with this as well. And when it comes time to paint his weapon, I'd suggest just cover the whole thing. Try and dodge the strap, because you'll find it easier to not have to paint that white again later. We're just going to coat the whole musket. There might be a little too much water in my paint. Oh well, I'm going to need to give it a second coat anyway. But let's come back and get a nice look at that when that's finished. Now after a second coat, we've got a nice solid colour, really dark weapon there. What we'll do now is spin him around. Let's get into his... Oh, I've got way too much brush. Way too much paint on my brush there. Let's get some fur brown. Get into his pack here. Same as usual, we're just trying to avoid going over any of the white straps. We're not terribly concerned if we do end up hitting them. If you wanted to, you could instead use something like Monster Brown, or even Banshee Brown here if you want a really bright finish. Now using Ash Grey, we'll paint in his pack roll here. This is a nice light grey. And at the same time, if he's got gaiters, we'll fill these in too. Now this little knapsack on the side here would be an off-white colour. So I'm going to use Drake Tooth for this. You might choose instead to use something like Brain Matter Beige, wonderful names, or even Banshee Brown. It's up to you. This will probably need a couple of coats if you have, you see I've splashed a little blue on here, so I'll let this dry, come back and give it a second, and make sure as well that you follow around the front to, follow the strap for that, if you can, if you can find it. Now we can finally start applying some of the black details to him. Now when it comes to black, I ordinarily suggest don't use a straight flat black except as a shade, because the way that the light catches these things is ordinarily not a pure black that we see out in, I was going to say nature, but you know what I mean, in reality. So I'm using for all of my black details here Necromancer Cloak, because you'll see this is very close to black, but there's just a little bit of grey to it. So we can also shade this and get some nice, get some depth to that too. Now there are quite a few black details, so we're also going to paint in his helmet. A little bit more paint for that. I'll just go around now and fill in, funnily enough, any black details. And if you do need to come back and give it a second coat, you know what to do. So once we've filled in our black areas, it's time to tidy up our white. And you can do as much of this as you like, cruise around the model, fix up any little splotches that you need to, straighten out cross belts. This is really a tidy up stage. So keep an eye out for any areas where you might have splashed your white. Fix those up now. And I'd suggest just give the trousers a quick once over to make sure that they have a nice solid colour. Now, as with everything we've discussed so far, there are schools of thought when it comes to braided cord. Now, generally, I would suggest that for the scale we're working at, and certainly, the method we want to use, a little bit of gold paint is just fine for this. You can use like a very dark brown and then carefully layer on, brighter yellow colours. But to my mind, for what we're doing, just a little bit of greedy gold will work fine. I am going to need to tidy that up, I think. So his strap would also likely have been this brassy sort of bronze colour. So fill that in too. And once that's done, I've got here gunmetal. And there's a bit of a context clue in the name about what we're going to use this for. Any metallic parts, obviously fill these in now. Take your time here. And once we're finished with this, I'm going to use a little bit of shining silver. And I will just quickly paint up the buttons using that. Now with those last couple of details applied, it's time to go back and just finish off those last couple of tidy up stages if you have made any mistakes. So I'm going to get my electric blue and just tidy up some of the jacket. You'll probably find that it's the blue and the yellow you most want to fiddle with here. But anywhere that you do need to just tidy up now, go ahead and straighten things out. Now with all of those base coats applied and our little touch-up stages done, what I'm going to do next is to actually varnish them. I've got a gloss varnish and I'm going to go ahead and spray this on them because we want to change up how the shade is going to sort of sit over the surface of the model. And a varnish is a really good way to do that. So let's go ahead and spray varnish them and then give them about 20 minutes for that to set properly. Now once that's had plenty of time to set properly, this is what we've got. And he might look a little bit like an old tin soldier from, 1976 or some such. It's pretty intense. What we're going to do now, though, is to hit him with a shade. And for this, we're going to use strong tone. Now this is a bit of a brown color, and you might wonder why. Honestly, it's still going to give us the best all-over shading effect. And we're going to thin it down a little bit first. So if you were going to use, say, strong tone from the dip, then it wouldn't matter too much if you were just going to use that straight from the can. But when it comes to our... oh, come on, focus, you silly thing. When it comes to the shade, this is a little strong straight out of the pot. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 drops of that. And then I've got here the mixing medium. Now this is great because it allows us to sort of soften the effect, but without losing the color, which is what we want. So 1, 2, and 3. I'm going to grab my brush and we'll mix those together. And you'll see this goes slightly cloudy, and that's pretty much what we want. That is, working properly. I'm using here the small dry brush for this, and it's also going to be ideal for applying it. And speaking of applying, let's just start brushing this over the whole miniature. Now, this is going to look quite weird going on, and I would suggest here that you don't really want to, you don't want to bucket it on and just leave it sitting in one place. Guide it towards your recesses. So anywhere like on his trousers here, you've got this little dip. Just try and get a little bit of it into there. But this will settle fairly naturally of its own accord. All you want to do is go around the whole model and just apply a quick coat of this, making sure that you are working it in everywhere. Now because we've used a shade which doesn't have a gloss component, it actually brings down the gloss varnish quite nicely. We're still going to want to actually matte varnish over the top of all of this later, but for the time being, that's not too bad. Now you can probably hear me prepping up my brush over there. I've got here some fresh electric blue, and we're going to go back over some areas of his jacket. I'd suggest you could, if you wanted to, just go straight to some highlights of that void shield blue we saw earlier. But I think just tidying up some of the areas, and really, how much of this you do is up to you. Just get the point back on my brush there. And I'm going to do the same thing in a moment with moon dust and that yellow. Now that's really quick, very simple to do. One that you can skip if you want to though. I've got now some white, and I'm going to do the same thing to all of his straps. Now it is up to you whether or not you want to do this to his trousers as well, because of course, if you're trying to keep trousers white in campaign conditions, well, good luck to you. But for our miniatures, it's up to you if you like the style of it. So I'm going to brighten up these cross braces, do his chest stuff, and then I'll make a decision on whether or not I want to highlight. No, I am going to highlight his trousers. Never mind. Now, I did mention that void shield blue earlier, and I'm actually going to use this now. I am going to apply just a couple of light highlights along the back of his sleeve. That might be a little bit much. Now there's that sky blue I was looking for. I'm actually quite happy with that. Good to know that that void shield blue would come in handy after all. What I'm going to do now is to paint up his face, and I've done faces in a few videos now. All I'm going to do is to use Barbarian flesh and then a little bit of kobold skin and give that a flesh wash over the top. Now because I'm quite enjoying painting this fella, I've mixed up 2 parts Necromancer Cloak and 1 Ash Grey, colours that we have already got, And I'm just going to do a light little line along the very edge of his helmet here. And using the same mix, let's just sort of dap over the plume on his helmet. Now finally, I've got a little bit of plate mail metal here, and I'm just going to tidy up and brighten some of these areas on his weapon. After this, what I'm going to do is just to go ahead and varnish him. I'll give him a final matte varnish to seal all of these colors down. And then we'll finish off his base, and once I finish all of those, let's get a look at what he looks like. And there we have it. At last, our Bavarian is complete. Now from here, there's a ton that you could still do. You could highlight his pack roll, all sorts of things. But I think honestly, there comes a stage with these miniatures that you need to say, all right, that's enough. He's done. Now, I know I say this all the time, but I actually really enjoy doing this. And the Bavarians are a force that I don't think you see very often on the table. So if you're looking for a fun project to do something a little unusual, these guys are definitely worth checking out. So as I mentioned earlier, there will be a couple of interesting historical sources in the description below, as well as another painting guide that I actually really like the look of. So worth checking that out if you want to see how somebody else would tackle it. As always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking over in paints and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Ben Hicks, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, and Connor. You guys are fantastic. So any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Facebook are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.